Good afternoon. I'm Brad Gomez from Florida State University, and I'm pleased to be with you today and to have the chance to introduce our next speaker in the Empire Lecture Series, Vincent Hutchings. Vincent Hutchings is a professor of political science, professor of Afro-American and African Studies, and research professor at the Center for Political Studies at the Institute of Social Research at the University of Michigan. Vincent's published work appears regularly in our discipline's top journals, and he's the author of 2 books, African Americans in the American Political System with Lucius Barker, Mac Jones, and Catherine Tate, and Public Opinion and Democratic Accountability, published by Princeton University Press. Vince was a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Scholar, and he's received multiple grants from the National Science Foundation. In 2012, he was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He also is currently one of the principal investigators for the American National Election Studies. The American electorate is divided along racial lines. Hutchings argues that one consequence of this division is that Republican and Democratic candidates are incentivized to cater to a mostly white and racially conservative electorate by relying on subtle and sometimes not so subtle racial appeals. Please join me in welcoming Vincent Hutchings to explore this important topic.
Thanks for that introduction, Brad. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. So I'm going to try to adhere to the time frame as well as I can. I've got a number of comments that in some ways build on the comments from the previous speaker, Ted Carmine's. They also focus on ideology, partisanship, and race. The title is a bit of a mouthful and maybe not the most succinct way to convey what we're getting to. But as you'll see momentarily, we'll be focusing very much on contemporary presidential politics and issues of race. I also want to say before I get started here that the work that I'll be discussing this afternoon is very much derived from a co-authored project with Vanessa Cruz Nichols, Legina Gauss, and Spencer Piston. So I certainly want to give my co-authors appropriate credit. All right, so just by way of starting out here, if this is working. Aha. All righty. So let's start out with something not that controversial. Oh, well, all right, too late. Obama. And we're all familiar with the rumors that exist about Obama regarding his place of birth as well as his religion. The rumors are sufficiently grave and were sufficiently problematic at the outset of the 2008 campaign that, of course, he needed to release his long-form birth certificate in order to address some of these concerns. Now, it was not as effective. That's a darkened picture there, but you can see a picture of Obama superimposed over a couple of, the baby of a chimpanzee. It did not succeed to the extent that he would have hoped for in terms of dispelling these rumors, and indeed, we're now many years removed from the 2008 campaign, and a significant fraction of the electorate continues to buy into these rumors. So I wanted to start with these images in part to kind of drive home the fact that race remains a very contentious issue, even with respect to the current occupant of the White House. So on the one hand, when you think about Obama and you think about some of the issues of race which have surrounded his candidacy and his presidency, you think about some of the negatives, but there are positives as well that I also want to highlight. Some of these were brought to our attention with a comment, kind of an off-the-cuff comment by Harry Reid, which takes the following form, as you can see there. So Reid was very much impressed by Obama, as were many people when he emerged on the national scene, in part because of his oratorical gifts, but also because some of the aspects of his, just his kind of demographic, his ancestry, as it were, relative to the usual black candidates that we encounter. And so I show these sets of images to start to represent kind of two sides of the coin. There was racial animus, arguably associated with the emerging candidacy of Barack Obama, but there was also a sense of promise, a sense of, well, dare I say, hope. And all of that is important to think about, which I'll return to momentarily. But before I do so, I want to kind of step back a bit and talk a bit about the extent to which race has for some time and continues to structure our partisan system. I'm going to start here with a quote from Dr. King, actually shortly before he was assassinated in 1968. And King is making the point very much about the persistent and deep role that race plays in American politics. The words we're seeing here on screen are very blunt and perhaps not the sorts of words we're used to seeing associated with Dr. King, but he was making a case at this stage of his life and at this point in American politics, 1968, about the increasing role that race has played and the really fundamental role that it plays in our politics. It's important to think about that because the point that Dr. King was making back then is just as true now, or at least maybe arguably even more so in the 21st century. And a lot of this is played out in the context of, well, for one thing, going back even further to the 1964 contest is really arguably when a lot of this exploded on the scene. So going back 50 years or so, we see that the partisan divide in the context of the party system really emerges with the candidacy, of course, of Goldwater and Johnson. It has emerged such that in the contemporary era, most Republicans, the overwhelming majority of Republicans, something on the order of 90%, tend to be white Americans. And although it's a little harder to see with the shading there on the screen, many supporters of the Democratic Party are far more racially and ethnically diverse. So this was not true in the 1950s and in earlier periods of American history. But at least since the Johnson-Goldwater contest, moving into the 70s and even into the 21st century, we have a partisan divide, very much an ideological divide, but it's kind of mapped onto a racial and ethnic divide as well. All of this is relevant and plays itself out in terms of voting patterns, which are quite stark. So just going back to 2008, it's worth noting, by the way, that the figures I'm putting up here for the 2008 contest are even more stark with respect to 2012. So we can see that virtually all of the African Americans in the exit poll sample voted for candidate Obama. It's worth noting that that's mostly about party and not about race, although I suppose one of the themes of my comments this afternoon is about how intertwined those two have become. Because, of course, if we go to the 2004 contest or the 2000 contest, we would also see figures that don't look all that different from what you see there on screen. And increasingly, emerging populations like Asian Americans and Latinos are also gravitating towards the Democratic Party. So it's a very, well, emerging, or I should say a bifurcated process or racial dynamic that's emerging with the party system. All of that is by way of a backdrop of the comments I'll be talking about, the comments I'll be delivering this afternoon in the form of Barack Obama, how people have responded to him, how the candidate and his campaign has responded to this historical backdrop. All right, so a number of points I want to make here. And I'm going to bring some evidence to bear on these claims a bit later. But to start, I'd just like to highlight a couple of the following points. First, candidates, I and my collaborators have argued, candidates in the contemporary era are motivated to try to mobilize white voters, who are, by the way, primarily Republicans, by distancing themselves from racial minorities, African Americans and Latinos for the most part, but in some cases other groups as well. But another strategy is to try to associate one's opponent with these same stigmatized groups. Now, these are broad and maybe even bold comments that we're making here, but I think that there's some considerable support in the literature, some of which I'll be providing this afternoon. The ways in which these candidate efforts, campaign efforts play themselves out are often grouped into two broad categories. On the one hand, there are explicit campaign appeals, and on the other hand, there are implicit appeals. And in a way, those labels kind of define themselves. For the most part, explicit appeals are ones in which racial nouns are employed. It's not done in the crude kind of segregationist fashion that some of us are familiar with from the earlier periods in American history. But even today, these kinds of tactics can still be used. I'll provide some examples a bit later. Implicit appeals are perhaps somewhat safer because one has more deniability with such a strategy. These are appeals that do not rely upon racial nouns, that rely upon code words, examples of which I'll provide momentarily as well. And in many cases also kind of visual strategies, visual cues meant to evoke issues of race without actually having to, well, use racial nouns. So let me talk a little bit by way of some examples here. Now, when I talk about racial code words, I have some specific phrases in mind. I should say, although I won't have time in my comments this afternoon to go into some of the literature, the evidence that's been amassed on this question, that studies have been done by myself and a range of other scholars that have demonstrated that the use of these words is often sufficient to kind of activate or prime, as it were, the latent racial animosities that exist across a broad range of the American population. So these are just a couple of the examples that, again, this is not terribly original. Many of us already know about some of these words. They're thrown out by candidates in an effort to try to invoke race without actually doing so in an overt fashion. We hear this. I'll provide some additional examples. I'll associate them with particular candidates. And just to kind of forecast where I'm going here, the point of all of this is to note that candidates do this on both sides of the political aisle, and they have incentives to do it. But there's a reason why they engage in these kinds of strategies, and I'll talk about some more here as I move forward. The reason they do it is because it works. They do it because it works, because people, maybe not all that different from the people here in this room, respond to such efforts. All right, so now I'll get a little bit more specific. The reference to states' rights. This may be as old as the Civil War, indeed even older than the Civil War. States' rights is sometimes just about states' rights, and sometimes states' rights is, well, not just about states' rights. Ronald Reagan proclaimed this, of course, as he was launching his 1980 campaign for the presidency, which was also, perhaps not coincidentally, located in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers were murdered, of course, in the 1960s. But to demonstrate that I'm not, in the spirit of bipartisanship, it wasn't just Republicans who have engaged in this kind of language or strategy, but also Democrats as well. So here's just a quote quickly here from Bill Clinton, then candidate Clinton, as he was launching his 1992 campaign for the presidency. So this notion about ending welfare as we know it was an effort on the part of the Clinton campaign to try to demonstrate that his campaign was different than his predecessors, than previous typically liberal Democratic candidacies. And in many respects, it succeeded. Aha, there we go. This is a lengthier quote, but it's from Bob Dole. There we go. And this is, Dole, of course, ran for the presidency in '96, and this was kind of one of the efforts on the part of Dole to go after what seemed to be a pretty easy target, which were racial quotas, affirmative action, typically very unpopular in the American electorate. So there may be a number of things that one could highlight in this slide, but I just wanted to indicate that this is done frequently. It's done across the partisan aisle, and sometimes racial nouns are employed, and sometimes they're not. And none of these examples are drawn from Mississippi. Well, actually, one of them is, but they're not drawn from the 1960s. The notion is that this can happen with mainstream, in many cases, successful politicians. What I wanted to show is an ad from 2008 featuring John McCain. Now, in this ad, it's not a beat over your head kind of approach that McCain is adopting, but what I want you to draw your attention to is this is an ad ostensibly by McCain to highlight the fact that Obama is lacking in substance, that he's a celebrity, but he doesn't have what it takes to run the nation that is the leader of the free world. And he links him to celebrities. But the particular celebrities that he selects is probably not coincidental. So I want to draw your attention to that point.
He's the biggest celebrity in the world. But is he ready to lead? With gas prices soaring, Barack Obama says no to offshore drilling and says he'll raise taxes on electricity. Higher taxes, more foreign oil. That's the real Obama.
I'm John McCain, and I approve this message.
So I like this ad from McCain for a number of reasons, one of which is the fact that the word foreign is linked to the image of Obama near the end of the ad there, you may have noticed, but also because two young, white, blonde women are juxtaposed with the African-American candidate running for president. And I would suggest that that's probably not by accident. Now, this may strike some of you, maybe most of you, as a stretch. Is that, well, come on, is there really a racial intent there? But again, in part because of time constraints, I won't have a chance to go into all the evidence that suggests that these seemingly subtle efforts are indeed what I've described them as. Just bear with me for the moment that this sort of thing is at least plausible. Again, in the spirit of bipartisanship, I'm going to make a reference here to a Democratic effort in the context of the primary in 2008. In this instance, we're talking about, although you can't see it so clearly there, Hillary Clinton. And Clinton, in the latter stages of her very tough contest with then Senator Obama, of course, made the following comment that you can see there on screen about the references to the hardworking Americans that she was more able to address or mobilize or appeal to than was her opponent. But she wanted to drive that point home, hardworking, white Americans, just in case we didn't get the message. It's, I think, not by accident that such an appeal was crafted in the way that it was. And what I want to present to you this afternoon is that that's not by accident. It's the sort of thing that's designed to appeal to a constituency. Candidates do this sort of thing because they have a sense that it's going to work. So in part because of all these things I've tried to discuss, perhaps maybe quicker than I would like to, and perhaps not with as much depth as I could prefer in order to make the case, Obama was in a position of a disadvantage when he was running for the presidency in 2008. And I started my talk out by showing some of these images associated with the notion that he's a Muslim or not born in the US. A number of studies have demonstrated that because of these disadvantages, these penalties as it were, Obama didn't do as well as he might have done in 2008. So in a variety of ways that I'll avoid here this afternoon, the number that people have landed on is a penalty somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5%. That is to say, even though he won, of course, and he won the popular vote and the electoral vote, he would have done better had he not suffered this penalty. And in part, this penalty was manifest, as I've said throughout, in terms of these persistent rumors about his birthplace and his religion. So a lot of work has demonstrated that race played a role in all of this. But in keeping with the larger theme I'm trying to push this afternoon, I'd like to suggest that it wasn't simply the case that race influenced the extent to which people embraced these rumors, but race also played a role in the extent to which the Obama campaign was able to blunt these rumors. All right, so what do I mean by that? Well, first let me provide, at least briefly, some sense about the extent to which race contributed to these rumors. So some work has shown by Maxwell and her colleagues that racial resentment is very much associated with endorsement of the notion that Obama is a Muslim or that he was not born in the U.S. and therefore not eligible to be president. There's also evidence suggesting that at least some Americans do not view Obama as American, as similar white politicians like Hillary Clinton. Indeed, similar politicians who are white who are not themselves even American, like Tony Blair. Turns out Tony Blair is more American than Obama is. And it's also the case that the link between racial considerations and the rumors, they set up a kind of a perverse incentive structure for Obama and his campaign in order to find some way to address them. So I've kind of alluded to this before. I'll say again that if race is helping to fuel these rumors, then the incentive structure is such that the Obama campaign needed to also exploit or address the racial component of these rumors in order to tamp them down, in order to diminish them. And what I'd like to talk about really in the remainder of my comments this afternoon is the ways we speculate in which the Obama campaign was able to manage all of this. And again, the context is essentially that, yes, Obama faced this penalty because of his race, because of these rumors and in other ways. But of course, he still won in 2008, and he won again in 2012. So the question that we have, of course, is not so much whether race was associated with these rumors, but in spite of those rumors being out there, how was it that Obama was able to win, to make those rumors not as broad as they might have been, not as broadly accepted? So there are a number of claims here that I'm going to provide you some brief support for, hopefully, and then we can talk about this in Q&A. But we argue, my co-authors and I, that the Obama campaign engaged in what we're referring to as whitewashing. What does that mean? Well, the campaign wanted to distance the candidate from these negative rumors by trying to distance himself from the extent to which they were associated with his race. So he wanted to tamp down his race. Indeed, he wanted to alter the way in which his race was perceived. One of the ways he did that, we argue, is that he reminded voters of his mixed-race ancestry. We argue that he also wanted to remind voters of the extent to which he had a kind of a middle America upbringing. He actually was, of course, brought up in Hawaii, but there's a generation removed to get to Kansas, and he wanted to remind people about that. We think that the candidate wanted to avoid racial issues as much as possible because doing so would help him electorally. So this has to do both with policy content, but it also has implications for just visual association with African Americans and other racial minorities. Now, for a variety of reasons, we're arguing that this whitewashing strategy is most effective among Republicans, primarily because Republicans are the ones most likely to think that Obama is a Muslim or born outside the U.S. And it turns out, of course, Republicans tend to be, on average, more racially conservative. This point I've already made, so I'll just skip over that. Be a little bit more specific here about some of the hypotheses that we generate. My co-authors and I have argued that the Obama campaign in 2008 wanted to try to blunt the effect of these rumors. And in order to blunt the effect of these rumors, the campaign sought to associate the candidate with white supporters as much as was possible. Similarly, we argue that the campaign sought to play up the mixed-race ancestry of the candidate, of Obama, so as to make it more difficult for voters to perceive him as Muslim or to perceive him as not being a real American. And as I've indicated, for a variety of reasons, we expect this to be particularly effective among Republicans. All right, so there are really two data sources that we're going to bring to bear on this question that I'll show, and then we'll have a chance, hopefully, to open it up to a little Q&A. First of all, we do a content analysis to assess the extent to which these cues that I've just described were present both visually and in some cases verbally in a broader set of political ads that were developed by the candidate. And then we're going to hone in on a particular specific campaign ad and kind of break down the elements within that ad. I'm going to argue that that ad has many of these so-called whitewashing qualities in order to try to convey a particular image of Barack Obama so as to at least minimize the number of people who thought that he was somehow foreign. All right, so the content analysis very quickly was simply based on a random sample of about 20 ads, both from John McCain, run in 2008, and from Barack Obama. And the aim here was simply to see how many white faces, white people, identifiably racially white individuals were in the ads run, at least in a random sample of ads that we selected for Barack Obama. And what we find is that the Obama ads contain far more whites than was the case for the McCain ads. Just to provide some context here, of course, the country is roughly 65–66% non-Hispanic white, and the electorate is roughly 74% non-Hispanic white. So even granting the fact that whites do in fact represent the majority of the electorate and the country, the Obama campaign still overrepresented them. And McCain actually was closer to more or less what the actual percentage of whites are in the country. Similarly, with respect to African Americans, we find comparable results here. So in the case of McCain, we get a number that is roughly equivalent. So African Americans, of course, about 12–13% of the population, and McCain was more or less on the nose there. Obama, on the other hand, was not. Now, what I'm going to show you next is another ad, but I wanted to set it up before we got to that. So this ad that I'm about to show you, the Country I Love ad, is an ad that was the ad that Obama launched his campaign with in 2008. At the beginning of the general election, this is how he was introducing himself to the broader American electorate. The ad has many of the features that I've been trying to discuss this afternoon. It's going to highlight, it's a biographical ad, and on its face, it seems pretty innocuous, just about his particular biographical, the elements of his history. But it's portrayed in a particular way, we would argue, in order to try to make him seem less foreign. And race was very much embedded in that effort, and it's embedded in the imagery and in the language as well of this ad. So I want you to pay attention when I run this ad, and the ad I'm going to show you at the outset is a slightly modified version of an actual ad that Obama ran. The only thing that we've modified about it is not the narration, but we've removed the imagery of his mother and his grandparents, who he was raised with, his white grandparents. But pay attention to the language as well, the code words that I've talked about, references to hardworking, references to self-reliance, to working without excuses, to welfare, moving people off of welfare, et cetera. All right, so let's see it.
I'm Barack Obama. America is a country of strong families and strong values. My life's been blessed by both. I was raised by a single mom and my grandparents. We didn't have much money, but they taught me values straight from the Kansas heartland where they grew up. Accountability and self-reliance, love of country, working hard without making excuses, treating your neighbor as you'd like to be treated. It's what guided me as I worked my way up, taking jobs and loans to make it through college. It's what led me to pass up Wall Street jobs and go to Chicago instead, helping neighborhoods devastated when steel plants closed. That's why I passed laws to moving people from welfare to work, cut taxes for working families, extended health care for wounded troops who'd been neglected. I approved this message because I'll never forget those values. And if I have the honor of taking the oath of office as president, it will be with a deep and abiding faith in the country I love.
So very quickly here, I'm just going to show you the actual ad that we presented to the folks who participated in this experiment. We were interested in whether or not exposure to one of these ads or the other had an impact on their perception of Obama with respect to his religion and his place of birth.
I'm Barack Obama. America is a country of strong families and strong values. My life's been blessed by both. I was raised by a single mom and my grandparents. We didn't have much money, but they taught me values straight from the Kansas heartland where they grew up. Accountability and self-reliance, love of country, working hard without making excuses, treating your neighbor as you'd like to be treated. It's what guided me as I worked my way up, taking jobs and loans to make it through college. It's what led me to pass up Wall Street jobs and go to Chicago instead, helping neighborhoods devastated when steel plants closed. That's why I passed laws moving people from welfare to work, cut taxes for working families, extended health care for wounded troops who'd been neglected. I approved this message because I'll never forget those values. And if I have the honor of taking the oath of office as president, it will be with a deep and abiding faith in the country I love.
All right, so it's noteworthy that both with respect to his family and the supporters of the candidate, the particular ad we just showed there, the original ad, has almost exclusively white supporters. Now, not literally exclusively. There were a couple. If you really look closely, if you really slow down the image, if you really take out a microscope, you can find a couple of non-whites in the ad. But for the most part, it's entirely white. So the relevant question here is whether those seemingly subtle differences make a difference. We argue that they should, and we'll demonstrate that they do. In the version of the ad that Obama did not run, but that he might have run, that was a plausible ad he could have constructed, that would have more or less conveyed the same point, same basic set of code words, the same biographical information, just removing an image of his mother and grandparents and his white supporters. In that condition, as one might have expected, and as is true in other data sets, Republicans, a non-trivial fraction of them, think that Obama was not born in the United States. But in the ad that he ran, we find a very different result. Now, I want to be clear here. The point is not that anyone who saw that ad as a consequence won't think that Obama was not born in the U.S. The point is the differences across these conditions, that the imagery, perhaps coupled with the narration, is sending a particular message. And with respect to random selection in the placement of these conditions or respondents in these conditions, we're finding a very massive effect based on a very subtle change, but a change that's not by accident, we would argue. And similarly here, and I'm at the point where I'm almost ready to conclude, we get comparable effects when it came to the issue regarding his religion. All right, so let me end by making a number of comments about what we think this all means. The point of my comments this afternoon was to try to drive home the point that candidates in both parties have an incentive to appeal to the racial conservatism of the American electorate. The American electorate is mostly conservative on racial matters. That's not to say that we have not had progress in the domain of race over the past several decades. It's not to say that Americans haven't changed in any way. It's simply to say that on issues of racial policy, most Americans are racially conservative, which they are. And candidates want to appeal to most voters because candidates want to win. And candidates adopt a number of strategies in order to do that because they found over time that those strategies tend to work. On balance, certainly simplifying a bit here, but on balance, Republicans try to link Democrats with minorities, and Democrats try to avoid being linked with minorities. We call that whitewashing. It's consequential to make reference to this. It's consequential to identify this, we argue, because it isn't just relevant for campaigning, it also can have relevance for governing. Obama, in part because of his race, in part because of the dynamics that I've tried to describe this afternoon, has also, of course, avoided discussing race in the presidency, not just on the campaign trail. And so that might be consequential depending upon the kind of policy outputs you might desire. So I think that my concluding point here is that we are quick to criticize candidates who adopt these strategies, and we're especially quick to do so when they belong to the opposite party. But it's imperative that if we're serious about this effort to try to remove these efforts, these appeals from American politics, that we bring scrutiny to bear not just on the candidates with whom we disagree for partisan and ideological reasons anyway, but maybe perhaps especially for the ones with whom we agree. Candidates will continue to rely upon this strategy as long as they think it will work. And so the best way to get them not to rely upon it is to convince them that it perhaps won't work after all. Thank you.
We have several minutes for questioning, so if you have a question, please raise your hand.
Very interesting, Vincent. Especially the experiment is pretty strong. But in looking at that ad, the thought ran through my mind that even if there was no doubt about, or there was no rumor about where Obama was born, or no rumor about his religion, I could imagine that ad having been shown even under those circumstances. Because it's not just to say I'm not foreign born, it's I'm an American like you. I'm not going to be simply the candidate of African Americans. I'm a candidate of everybody. So you could imagine the same strategy independent of this thing that you actually showed really mattered in regard to the view of him as foreign born or Muslim.
Yeah, so Gary's question is a good one. So Obama did face some particular challenges that were unique to him that would not apply to other Democrats and perhaps to other black candidates. Obviously, he's got an African and an Arabic name, so that made things a little more difficult for him. But in the effort that I've pursued with my collaborators, we've identified other candidates who don't have that particular, let's call it a deficit, and who nevertheless engage in similar action. So for example, when Harold Ford was running for the Senate in Tennessee, Harold Ford, who was an African-American Democrat, kind of moderate to conservative Democrat, all of a sudden discovered that his grandmother was white, which is interesting because her death certificate says that she was black, but he insists that she was white. Now, he happened to have made that discovery while he was on the campaign trail in Tennessee trying to generate support. And in other ways, candidates are trying to, to either via their ancestry or their policy preferences or whatever, to try to, in a way it's a straightforward, mainstream politics, trying to grab the median voter. But there are insidious kind of elements about it that I think we should be calling out, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Phil Howe, Adrian College. Are there voters for whom pointing out that he comes from racially mixed parents actually backfires and makes it worse?
Probably, yes. So if you didn't hear the question, it's about whether or not, in some respects, identifying his racially mixed ancestry might hurt him. I think that's probably true, but under the circumstances, he and his campaign wanted to try to indicate that he was a true blue American. And it was a risk that was worth taking under the circumstances. So I think that, he probably lost some voters as well. But of course, the voters who were likely to be turned off because he's racially mixed were probably likely to be turned off even if he wasn't racially mixed and he was just black.
Herman Cain was admittedly a hiccup of history. And his popularity was very short term. But the fact that he could win support among conservative Republicans even for a short period of time, what does that tell us about the implications of race in politics?
I think that when black Republicans run for office, there's a presumption that because they've made a conscious decision not to be Democrats, that there's less of a fear among some segment, not all, but some non-trivial segment of white voters. There's less of a fear that were they to be elected, that they would somehow govern on behalf of African Americans. So I think Herbert Cain and other candidates emerging from the Republican camp don't have that particular kind of albatross hanging around their neck. They have other baggage in some cases, but they don't have that particular problem that they need to address.
Your point on the racial conservativeness of the American electorate is well taken, but I'm wondering how you reconcile that with the inclusiveness of the Obama administration in the appointment of African Americans and Latinos, not just to major positions in the American government, but also very publicly visible positions in the American government as well, including women?
Yeah, that's a fair question about the inclusiveness in the demographic, gender, and kind of racial sense of the Obama, of his advisors, the people in his cabinet. And I think that, you know, candidates on balance, I think, would like to be all things to all people. They don't want to burn any bridges. So in some cases, they will emphasize some elements of their message to one crowd and other elements of their message to a different crowd. So I say all that to say that, yes, Obama, one can believe everything that I'm arguing up here, which of course one is also free not to believe, but one could still embrace that argument, and at the same time, it's not inconsistent with an effort to appeal to elements within the Democratic constituency by providing them symbolic representation, by, you know, appointing so-and-so to be Attorney General or so-and-so to be Secretary of State or whatever. Because of course, that doesn't require any kind of policy responsiveness. That's just about appointing particular people with particular demographics. So candidates do this. It's not peculiar to Barack Obama. I mean, I made in the paper that is undergirding this presentation, we also make reference to Bill Clinton. I made a brief reference to him in the presentation. Clinton had a very diverse cabinet as well, even as he ran on the platform of, I'm not your father's Democrat, right? I want to end welfare as you know it, as we know it. I want to make sure I preside over the execution of a black death row inmate in Arkansas. So Clinton, like a range of different politicians, sent different messages depending on the constituency he was trying to appeal to. The point I'm trying to make is that Barack Obama is no different in that regard. And the reason that people do this is because we respond to it, is because it works.
A lot of the themes that you've mentioned, I think, probably have a lot to do with the fact that as of 2008, Americans were not that familiar with Barack Obama. How did the sorts of themes you've drawn out in your ads change in 2012?
Well, they became familiar with him by the time the 2012 contest rolled around, but of course, many of the people who were familiar with him were less than enamored with him. So at this point, of course, we all know that Obama somewhat lost support among whites and among younger whites, basically among all segments of the white population in 2012. But he was able to make up for that by increasing his support among Asians in particular and Latinos. There was a mild drop in support among blacks, but moving from 95 to 93 is probably acceptable to him. So I think that in part what was going on in 2008, as you indicate, is trying to make sure he gets ahead of the message, and that the expectation that people might have about your traditional generic black candidate does not apply to me. And of course, we saw that embedded in the Country I Love ad, at least we would argue. So by the time 2012 runs around, you might think that the very manner by which he has governed would be sufficient to not have to worry about that. But the lens through which those actions were taken was very much interpreted in a partisan fashion. And by this I mean that the relatively moderate health care proposal put forth by Obama in his first term, which was a variant of something that Bob Dole actually championed back in the 90s, was viewed as if it were emerging from Karl Marx. My point being that even the moderate objective actions taken by the Obama administration were interpreted to be radical efforts to engage in reparations. So if people were responding to the actual Obama, maybe none of this would be as necessary, but they were responding to the character of Obama that some politicians had an incentive to propagate.
Just in response to that question, as one of the co-authors on this piece, the data was collected in 2011. So this is after Obama has released his birth certificate. He's not necessarily a candidate that's unquestionable or that has unfamiliar information about his biography. And it's also worth noting that that makes it a more conservative test. So I just wanted to point that out. There was another point about in terms of whether or not pointing out his mixed background had a negative effect on other outcome variables. So in the paper, there are additional outcome variables where we are observing that negative effect, but it's among racial conservatives and Republicans.
If this approach works, my guess then is not doing it doesn't work. And so if you were advising Hillary Clinton in the campaign next year, what would you advise her on her advertisements?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I guess it depends on if I was on the payroll or not. If I was on the payroll, I'd say you should do some version of what I just described here because it'll probably work. But I suspect I'm not likely to be on the payroll. And so really, in all seriousness, thinking about race relations more broadly, thinking about the health of our democracy, I would say that I would try to urge her not to fall prey to this temptation. That there are ways to court constituencies without solidifying negative images or stereotypes about stigmatized outgroups. There are ways to do that by playing, by taking to the high road. I mean, we have to believe that's true, or if we don't believe that to be true, then we shouldn't be upset when candidates do this in the context of race or religion or any other division. If at the end of the day it's just a slugfest, and let the best person win, then those of us who study divisions or ideological or racial conflict in the United States maybe should find something else to do.
Please join me in thanking Vince Hutchings.